Peter stood in front of the classroom door, his heart racing. Today was his first day in the United States, and while he had dreamt of this moment for years, he couldn't shake the wave of anxiety that washed over him. He had always known that moving to a new country would be challenging, but he hadn't anticipated how deeply the language barrier would affect him. He had studied English back in his home country of Poland, but the classroom lessons, the grammar drills, and the occasional conversations with tourists hadn't prepared him for this. The fast, fluid, and often overwhelming pace of spoken English in everyday life. Peter's first day at the university started off with confusion. He was a bright student, majoring in computer science, but sitting in the back row of the large lecture hall, he couldn't make sense of the professor's rapid explanations. It wasn't just the vocabulary that was throwing him off. It was the speed, the accent, and the natural way people here blended words together. It was as if they were speaking another language entirely. A language more complex than anything he had encountered in his textbooks. As the weeks passed, Peter found himself struggling more and more. His classmates would ask questions in perfect English, crack jokes with each other during breaks, and engage in lively discussions after class. Peter, on the other hand, felt like he was drifting further and further away from the conversation. He was frustrated. He was smart, hardworking, and capable. But his inability to communicate fluently in English made him feel invisible. He could understand what was being said, but when it came time for him to speak, the words seemed to disappear. One afternoon, Peter found himself sitting alone in the university library, feeling utterly defeated. He had always been an overachiever, someone who thrived in academic settings, but this was different. No matter how hard he studied, how many vocabulary lists he memorized, or how much he practiced in front of the mirror, he couldn't seem to get a grasp on the language. He felt stuck, and the thought of giving up crossed his mind more than once. But then something changed. Before we dive deeper into Peter's inspiring journey of overcoming the language barrier, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. If you've ever felt the struggle of learning English or are in the middle of your own language learning journey, this story will resonate with you. At Speak Well Academy, we share tips, strategies, and motivational stories to help you become fluent in English. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on content that could change the way you approach language learning. Peter was browsing the internet late one night when he stumbled across a blog written by another non-native English speaker. This person had struggled with learning English too, but their story ended with success. They had found a way to not only survive in an English-speaking country but to thrive in it. Their method wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't some secret formula. It was persistence, creativity, and a willingness to embrace failure. Reading that blog post sparked something in Peter. He realized that he had been going about learning English the wrong way. Up until now, he had been so focused on perfection, on getting every sentence, every verb tense, and every pronunciation exactly right, that he had forgotten the most important part of learning a language. Using it, mistakes and all. Peter decided to change his approach. He made a promise to himself. From now on, he wouldn't worry about speaking perfectly. He wouldn't obsess over getting everything right. Instead, he would focus on communicating, on getting his point across, even if it meant stumbling over a few words or mixing up his grammar. The next day, Peter walked into class with a new mindset. During the lecture, he raised his hand for the first time in weeks. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he pushed past the fear. When the professor called on him, Peter asked his question. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it was a little awkward. But the professor understood him, and more importantly, so did his classmates. A few of them even nodded in agreement with his point. That small moment, that tiny success, gave Peter the confidence he needed to keep going. Peter began immersing himself in English every chance he got. He started by changing the language on his phone and computer to English, forcing himself to interact with the language daily. He also began watching English TV shows and movies, not with subtitles in his native language, but in English. At first it was hard, really hard. But over time, his brain began to adjust. He started to pick up on the nuances of the language, the idiomatic expressions, the slang, the way people shorten certain phrases. Little by little, English began to feel less foreign and more familiar. One of the biggest turning points for Peter came when he joined a local English conversation group. At first, he was terrified of speaking in front of others, especially native speakers. He was worried they would judge him for his mistakes or struggle to understand his accent. But to his surprise, the group was incredibly supportive. Everyone there was learning English just like him. They weren't perfect either, but they were trying. And that's what mattered. In the conversation group, Peter practiced speaking in a low-pressure environment. He learned how to handle real-life situations, like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions. He also started making friends with people from different countries, all of whom were learning English too. These friendships became invaluable to him. Not only did they give him a chance to practice English outside of class, but they also gave him a support system. People who understood exactly what he was going through. Peter's confidence continued to grow. He began volunteering to give presentations in class, something he never would have imagined doing just a few months earlier. He still made mistakes, plenty of them, but each time he spoke, he felt a little more comfortable, a little more fluent. But it wasn't just about the technical side of learning English. Peter realized that to truly master the language, he had to immerse himself in the culture as well. He started attending local events, meeting native speakers, and engaging in conversations about things that weren't just related to school or work. He learned about American sports, popular TV shows, and even picked up a few regional accents. These experiences helped him feel more connected to the language. It wasn't just something he was learning in a classroom anymore, it was something he was living. There were setbacks, of course. Peter still had moments of doubt, times when he struggled to understand a conversation or mispronounced a word so badly that it caused confusion. But instead of letting these moments defeat him, he used them as learning experiences. He asked for feedback, he practiced more, and most importantly, he kept going. As the months passed, Peter's English improved dramatically. He went from being the quiet student in the back of the room to someone who actively participated in discussions, asked insightful questions, and even helped his classmates with their own language challenges. His professors noticed the change, as did his friends. Peter was no longer the shy, insecure student who felt lost in a sea of fast-talking native speakers. He had become confident, articulate, and fluent in English. Looking back, Peter realized that the key to his success wasn't just about studying harder or memorizing more vocabulary. It was about changing his mindset. He had to let go of the idea that he needed to be perfect and instead focus on communicating, learning from his mistakes, and staying consistent in his efforts. Peter's journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And now, as he stood in front of his class giving a presentation in flawless English, he knew that all the struggles, all the awkward conversations, and all the late-night study sessions had paid off. He had conquered his fear, mastered the language, and proven to himself that he could do anything he set his mind to. Peter's story didn't unfold as smoothly as it first seemed. In fact, after that small breakthrough in class where he raised his hand and spoke, something unexpected happened. He hit a plateau. You see, in the months that followed his initial burst of progress, Peter began to feel like he was stuck in the same place, despite all his hard work. He continued practicing daily, attending his conversation groups, and immersing himself in English as much as possible, but something felt off. His progress seemed to have slowed down. His fluency wasn't improving at the same pace it had been, and he still felt nervous when speaking to native speakers outside of his comfort zone. This plateau didn't just affect his confidence. It shook his entire sense of purpose. Peter had been riding the high of those early victories, but now, as the honeymoon phase of learning faded, he began to doubt whether he'd ever truly become fluent. Why wasn't he improving? What was he doing wrong? These questions circled in his mind, creating frustration and anxiety. One evening, after a particularly rough day at university, Peter sat down to assess his situation. He was considering scaling back his efforts. Maybe he was aiming too high. Maybe he should accept that fluency wasn't in the cards for him. But as he reflected on his journey, something clicked. Peter realized that, for the first time in months, he hadn't been pushing himself out of his comfort zone. He had found a safe rhythm, his conversation group, his podcasts, his TV shows, but it was all routine now. Sure, he was still practicing, but he wasn't challenging himself anymore. He wasn't putting himself in uncomfortable situations where he might fail. So Peter decided to make a bold move. He signed up for an internship program that required him to conduct all his meetings and presentations in English. It was a 6-week internship with an international company, and it terrified him. He knew this was beyond his current level, and that's exactly why he chose it. He needed to break the plateau, and this was how he was going to do it. The internship. A new challenge. On his first day at the internship, Peter's nerves were in overdrive. He was surrounded by professionals from all over the world. Some native English speakers, others fluent non-natives, but all of them spoke English with ease and confidence. Peter felt like the odd one out, and that old fear of being judged, of not being good enough, came rushing back. His first task was to introduce himself and give a short presentation on his academic background and career goals. As Peter stood up, his palms were sweaty, and his heart raced. He had rehearsed his presentation dozens of times in his room, but standing there, in front of so many experienced professionals, he felt like his mind went blank. He stumbled through his sentences, made awkward pauses, and mixed up his tenses. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, and it was humiliating. Afterward, Peter was sure he had blown it. He wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. The frustration was overwhelming, but something inside him refused to give up. He wasn't going to let one bad day derail everything. Peter decided to approach one of his colleagues, Maria, who had given an impressive introduction earlier in the day. Maria was from Spain and had once been in Peter's shoes, struggling to find her voice in English. He asked her for advice on how to improve his speaking under pressure. Maria smiled and said, "The trick isn't to avoid making mistakes. The trick is to make them and keep talking anyway." She explained how she, too, had struggled with English, but the key to her improvement had been putting herself in situations where mistakes were inevitable, like job interviews, public speaking, or in her case, a role in customer service. "You have to desensitize yourself to the fear," she said. "Eventually, the fear loses its grip on you. Facing the fear head-on." Maria's advice hit home for Peter. He realized he had been holding himself back by trying too hard to be perfect. He had been measuring his success by how few mistakes he made, when in reality, making mistakes was a sign that he was trying new things and pushing his boundaries. So Peter decided to embrace the discomfort. During the next team meeting, he didn't try to script every word in his head. Instead, he focused on the ideas he wanted to convey. When he made mistakes, and he didn't apologize or freeze up. He just kept talking. And to his surprise, no one laughed or looked down on him. In fact, his colleagues were encouraging, offering feedback and helping him find the right words when he stumbled. It was during one of these meetings that Peter experienced a breakthrough. He was presenting a solution to a technical problem the team had been facing, and for the first time, he felt completely in control of his words. His speech wasn't perfect, but he was clear, concise, and confident. By the time he finished, his colleagues were nodding in agreement, and one of the senior managers even complimented him on his insights. That day, Peter realized that fluency wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about being able to communicate effectively, even when you weren't perfect. The fear that had held him back for so long began to lose its power. He started participating more in meetings, volunteering for presentations, and even engaging in casual conversations with his colleagues during lunch breaks. Just as Peter began to feel more comfortable in his English-speaking environment, another challenge arose. The company announced that they were expanding into the Asian market, and Peter was assigned to work on a project with a team in Japan. Suddenly, he was faced with a new language barrier. Not only was he speaking English as a second language, but now he had to communicate with colleagues who also spoke English as a second language, often with heavy accents. At first, this threw Peter off. He had just gotten used to understanding native English speakers, and now he was struggling to communicate with people who, like him, were navigating English as a non-native language. Meetings were filled with misunderstandings, awkward pauses, and sometimes, complete confusion. But instead of letting this frustrate him, Peter saw it as an opportunity. He realized that being able to communicate with non-native speakers was an essential skill in the global workplace. So, he approached this new challenge with the same determination he had used to overcome his initial language struggles. He focused on speaking slowly and clearly, asking for clarification when needed, and being patient with himself and others when communication broke down. Over time, Peter became adept at navigating these cross-cultural conversations. He learned how to adapt his language to suit different audiences, simplifying his speech when necessary and using more technical terms when speaking with experts. This skill not only improved his communication at work but also deepened his understanding of the nuances of English as a global language. Just as Peter's internship was coming to an end, he was presented with one final challenge: the company's annual conference. As part of the internship program, Peter and his fellow interns were required to give a 10-minute presentation on a project they had worked on during their time with the company. The presentation would be in front of the entire company: executives, managers, employees, and even clients. Peter felt the familiar surge of anxiety. This wasn't just a small team meeting or a casual conversation with colleagues. This was a formal presentation in front of hundreds of people, many of whom were native English speakers. The stakes were high, and Peter knew that this would be the ultimate test of everything he had learned. In the days leading up to the conference, Peter practiced relentlessly. He rehearsed his speech over and over, recording himself and listening back to identify areas for improvement. He asked Maria to help him with his delivery, and she gave him tips on how to engage the audience and project confidence, even when he felt nervous. When the day of the conference arrived, Peter stood backstage, heart pounding, waiting for his turn to speak. As he walked onto the stage, he felt a wave of fear, but he also felt something else: determination. He had come so far, and this was his moment to prove to himself that he could do it. Peter took a deep breath, looked out at the audience, and began his presentation. His voice was steady, his words were clear, and as he spoke, the fear that had once paralyzed him began to fade. He wasn't perfect. He stumbled over a word or two, but he kept going. And when he finished, the audience erupted into applause. As Peter sat in the audience, watching the rest of the presentations, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. He remembered the boy who had sat in the back of the classroom, too scared to speak, and he realized that person was gone. In his place was someone who had faced his fears, embraced his mistakes, and ultimately, learned to communicate fluently in a language that had once seemed impossible. Peter's journey wasn't easy. It was filled with setbacks, frustration, and moments of doubt. But every challenge he faced taught him something new, and every mistake he made brought him one step closer to fluency. The most important lesson Peter learned was that fluency isn't just about knowing the right words or perfect grammar. It's about communication, confidence, and persistence. It's about using the language, even when you're scared, and embracing the process of learning, mistakes and all. Today, Peter is not only fluent in English but also a confident public speaker. He has given presentations at international conferences, led workshops, and even mentored other non-native English speakers who are just starting their own language learning journeys. And while his journey to fluency is far from over, after all, learning a language is a lifelong process, Peter knows that he has the tools, the mindset, and the determination to continue growing and improving. Peter's story is a reminder that learning English, or any language, is not a linear journey. It's full of twists, turns, setbacks, and victories. But the key to success is persistence, patience, and a willingness to embrace the discomfort of making mistakes. If Peter could overcome his fear of speaking English, tackle cross-cultural communication, and stand on stage giving a presentation in front of hundreds of people, so can you. Your journey may look different from Peter's, but the principles are the same. Setbacks are part of the process. Mistakes are opportunities to learn. And fluency is not an end goal. It's a journey that requires constant practice, reflection, and growth. So, whether you're just starting out or you've been learning English for years, keep going. The challenges you face today will be the victories you celebrate tomorrow. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. There are millions of people around the world learning English alongside you. And with the right mindset, anything is possible. What's your next step? How will you challenge yourself to move closer to fluency? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Speak Well Academy for more stories, tips, and strategies to help you become fluent in English. Keep learning, keep growing, and most importantly, keep speaking.